Do you have to identify yourself for the police in the state of Indiana? I want to talk about this question in the context of a man that was stopped in Talladega, Alabama. His name was Corey Dickerson. And so Mr. Dickerson, one late night in Alabama, he was out, he was jogging, going about his way, when all of a sudden a police car pulls up and the officer rolls down his window and he wants to know, who are you and where are you going? Now, the first lesson that we can learn from Mr. Dickerson is this: he remained calm. He didn't lose it. He didn't get upset. He didn't get angry. And he calmly responded. He said, "Hi, officer. My name is Corey. I would prefer to leave it at that. And I'm just out jogging." And so, fine and well, officer continues to talk. And at this point, again, Mr. Dickerson remains calm. But at this point, he wants to know, "Officer, have I done anything wrong and am I being detained?" Now, this is a very important question because this question, number one, if the officer says that he's not being detained, then that means that he's free to leave and to terminate that conversation and go about his business. But if the officer says that he is being detained, then the officer can't later on in court say that Mr. Dickerson was voluntarily just engaging in this conversation. Now, I won't get into the details of why that's so important, but I will just simply say this. That question is very important because when you are being detained, certain rights will apply. And in particular, if you're being detained, then at that point, you do have the right to be advised of your what we call Miranda rights. And we'll talk about that in another video. But needless to say, Mr. Dickerson is still there on the scene, and then several other officers actually arrive at this point in time. Again, Mr. Dickerson, officers, have I done something wrong? Am I being detained? And am I free to leave? So they don't directly answer him at that time. And so at this point in time, he lets them know, he said, "Officers, I want you to know that I'm about to pull out my cell phone." He does it very slowly, and he lets them know that he's about to record the conversation that they're having. And he also lets them know that in the event that something happens to his phone, if it's taken, if it's destroyed, the video footage will automatically upload to a protected server. So they're still talking, and then, in the midst of continuing to talk, Mr. Dickerson also uses his cell phone to let the officers know, and he calls right there on the spot, and he calls one of his relatives, and he tells them exactly where he is. He tells them that he's being detained by police officers, and he hasn't been told whether or not he's free to leave. So immediately after Mr. Dickerson completes his phone call, one of the officers takes the lead, very nice about it, very polite, and says, "You know what, Mr. Dickerson, we've wasted enough of your time here tonight. You're absolutely free to leave." Mr. Dickerson, at that point in time, resumes his job, terminates the conversation altogether, and he goes about his business. And so that brings me to this question. What if Mr. Dickerson had been right here in Indiana? What laws apply, and would he have any obligation to identify himself to these officers? Here's the answer. Indiana is about one of 30 what we call stop and identify states, which means that Indiana has laws on the books that say if an officer has a good faith belief, in fact, there's an act called the Good Faith Belief Act, which says that if a law enforcement officer in the state of Indiana has a good faith reason to believe that a citizen has violated a law and ordinance, then at that point in time, that officer has the right to request identification, such as name, address, and date of birth, or driver's license. Then the second part to Indiana's law is what's called a refusal to identify. So let's just say that Officers have a good faith reason to believe that some law or ordinance has been violated. They request for the proper identification or this information, and then the person refuses to identify. At that point, in Indiana, the state of Indiana has what's called a refusal to identify section of the law, which makes it a Class C misdemeanor for a person to knowingly or intentionally refuse to submit their identification to law enforcement officers. So there you have it. Lessons from a late night jogger and whether or not you actually have to identify yourself in the state of Indiana to law enforcement. One final thing to note with regards to the Good Faith Belief Act as well as the Refusal to Identify Act. This act and the law itself only applies if officers have a good faith belief that somehow, some way you've broken some law and or ordinance. Otherwise, you are free to go about your business and you do not have to identify yourself for law enforcement. Now, of course, that is easier said than done, but that is Indiana's law in a nutshell.